Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodes Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you a Western story today from 1897 by Alfred Henry Lewis. Lewis walked the earth from 1855 to 1914, growing up in Ohio. He was a lawyer and newspaperman, as well as an author of novels and short stories. His most popular writings were his Western Wolfville stories, set in a fictional mining camp in the Arizona Territory before the latter became a state. Today's story is one of them. The narration of the following story occurs between the author and an older gentleman referred to as the Old Cattleman, both of whom are sitting on the porch of a saloon, many years after the events the Old Cattleman describes. One question arising from this story is, have you ever been picked on by a mule? Hear the words of old. The Rival Dance Halls of Wolfville, from 1897, by Alfred Henry Lewis. It was sweet and cool after the rain, and the old cattleman and I, moved by an admiration for the open air which was mutual, found ourselves together on the porch. As in part recompense for his reminiscences of the several days before, I regaled my old friend with the history of a bank failure, the details as well as the causes of which were just then forcing themselves upon me in the guise of business. As I came to the end of my story, I said, "The fact is, the true cause of this bank's downfall was a rivalry, what one might call a business feud, which grew into being between it and a similar institution, which had opened as its neighbor. In the competition which fell out, they fairly cut each other's throat. They both failed." "And I takes it," remarked the old cattleman in comment, "one of these here trade duels way goes on vindictive and remorseless, same as if it's a personal fight between cowfolks over cattle." "Quite right," I said. "Money is often more cruel than men, and a business vendetta is frequently mere murder without the incident of blood. I don't suppose the life of your Arizona town would show these trade wars. It would take Eastern, that is, older conditions to provoke and carry one on." "No," replied the old gentleman, with an air of retrospection. "I don't recall nothing of the sort in Wolfville. We're too much in a huddle anyway. There ain't room for no such fracas nohow. Now the nearest we alls came to something like that was when the new dance hall started that time." As the old cattleman began arranging a smoke, he continued, "Which I now reckons this here is the only cataclysm in trade Wolfville ever suffered. The only time it comes to what you all Eastern sports would call a showdown in commerce. Of course, there was the laundry war, but that's between females and don't count. Females, while it's no sort of doubt they's the noblest and most exhilarating work of their Redeemer, is nervous that-a-way, and do any time to let their hair down their backs, amid a screech, and claw and lay for each other for luck. And, as I says, if you confines the festivities to them females engaged, and prevents the men standing in on the play, it's sure to wind up in sobs and forgiveness, and therefore it don't go. As I was saying, though, what I now relates is the only industrial trouble I recalls in Wolfville. I always remembers it, 'cause being as how I knew the party who was the aggravating cause thereof, it mortified me the way he jumped into camp all of a sudden and carries on to start a trade war. The first time I met him was ages before, when I freights with 8 mules over the old Fort Bascom trail from Vegas to the Panhandle. This Sharp, which he's a tenderfoot at this time, but plumb wolf by nature, trails up to me in the Early Rose Saloon in Vegas one day and allows he'd like to make a deal and go projecting over into the Panhandle country with me for a trip. Carrying freight that away for 3 weeks alone on the trail is heroin to the spirits of a gent like me who loves company. So I agrees, and there was no delay to it. Which I'm here to mention I regretted later that I took this person along on the freight job so easy. Not that he turned hostile, but he was always having adventures, and things kept happening to him. And finally, I thought he was surely dead and gone complete. A belief I learned later was an error. That trip broke me a fooling with shorthorns complete, and I didn't go near 'em for years after, like they was stinging lizards. Whatever did this here maverick do to me? Well, nothing much to me personal, but he kept a breeding of events which pestered me. We're out about 4 days when them mishaps begins. I camps over one sun on the Concha to rest my mules. I'm loaded some heavy with 6,000 pounds in the lead and maybe 4,000 pounds in the trail wagon. And I stops a day to give my stock a chance to roll and breathe and brace up. My off-wheel mule, a regular shavetail or inexperienced mule, is bad medicine. He was not only eager to kick tourists and others he took a notion against, but he was likewise what you all calls a kleptomaniac, and was out to steal and similar low-down plays. I warned this here tenderfoot who came along. His name was Smith, but I started calling him Colonel. I warned this shorthorn not to fuss round my Jerry mule, being, as I states, he was a mule whose mood is ornery. Don't go near him, Colonel, says I, and particular, don't go crowding round to get no rear views of him either. You all has no idea of the radius of that mule, what you might call his sweep. You never will till he's kicked you once or twice, and the information ain't worth no such price. So I don't reckon I'd fool with him, none whatever. And special, Colonel, I goes on, for I sure aims to do my duty by him. Don't lay nothing round loose where this here Jerry mule can grab it off. I'm the last freighter on the plains to go slandering and detracting of a poor helpless mule, unless it's straight. But if you takes to leaving keepsakes and mementos laying about casual and careless that-a-way, Jerry'll eat 'em. And the next thing you know, your keepsakes is within Jerry's interior. The fact is, stranger, this Jerry mule is a thief, I says. If he was a human, Jerry would be lynched. But otherwise, he's a sincere, earnest mule. And uphill or at a quicksand crossing, Jerry goes into his collar like a lion. So, I forgives him being a thief and allows it's a peccadillo or a small offense. Well, you bet, said this tenderfoot colonel. This here Jerry better not come no peccadillos on me. If you all maintains about 20 feet, I replied, between Jerry's hind hocks and you, and if you keeps your bric-a-brac in your war bags, you and Jerry'll get along like lambs. Now I warned you, and that's got to do. If Jerry and you gets tangled up hereafter, you ain't going to harbor no revenges agin 'em, nor make no ranacaboo plays to get even. Well, as I stated, we were camped on the Concha, and the colonel, who was always out to try experiments and new deals, put it up he'd go down to the river and take a swim. Thereupon he lined out for the water. Now Jerry was hanging about camp, for he's sort of a pet mule, allowing maybe I submits a ham rind or some such delicacy to him to chew on. And he heard the colonel suggest he'd swim some. So when the colonel pointed for the Concha River, Jerry sauntered along after, figuring, mighty likely, how he'd pass the hour a watching the colonel swim. I was busy cooking flapjacks at the time, which flapjacks is sure good food, and I didn't observe nothing of Jerry nor the colonel neither. They was away half an hour when I overheard screaming, though I couldn't make out no words. I don't have to get caught in no landslide to tumble to a game, and I was aware at once that Jerry and the colonel had got their destinies mixed. Naturally, I goes over to the held of strife, aiming to save Jerry, or save the colonel, whichever had the other down. When I burst on the scene, the colonel started for me, spluttering and making noise and pointing at Jerry, who stood there with an air of innocence. The colonel's upper lip was hanging down strange, like an anteater's, and he couldn't talk. It was all mighty amazing. "What's all this tumult about?" I says. The short of the right was this. The colonel went in for a swim, and he laid out his false teeth that-a-way on a stone. When he came for his teeth, they was surely gone, and there stood Jerry putting it on he was asleep. Them teeth was filed away inside Jerry. The colonel raved round frightful, and wanted to kill Jerry and amputate him, and scout for the teeth. But I wouldn't have it. I was going to need Jerry down further on the quicksand fords of the Canadian, and, as I explained, them teeth is a wreck by now and ain't no good even if he got 'em back. Jerry munched on his food powerful. After a while, I rounded up the colonel and herded him back to camp. Jerry sure sawed off a sore affliction on that tenderfoot when he took in them teeth. I could see that. His lip hung like a blacksmith's apron, and he couldn't talk straight, just made signs or motions like he was deaf. It was maybe 2 weeks later when Jerry got another shot at the colonel. It was the evening after the night Jerry snuck into camp, softfoot as a coyote, nosed open the grub box, and ate up 5 bottles of whiskey, all we had. We had pitched camp, and I had hobbled this Jerry mule and his mate, the other wheeler, and throwed 'em loose, and was busy hobbling my Nicewing mule when trouble began fomenting between my tenderfoot and Jerry. The fact is, trouble was done fomented. This colonel, being some heated about that whiskey, and plumb sore on Jerry on account of them teeth, allowed to himself he'd take a trace chain and warp Jerry once for luck. If this here tenderfoot had been free with me, and invited me into his confidence touching his designs, I'd have took a lariat rope and roped and throwed Jerry for him, and tied the felon down, and let the colonel wallop him an hour or so. But the colonel was full of variety that-a-way, or maybe he thought I'd side with Jerry. Anyhow, he selected a trace chain, and, without saying a word, danced all cautious towards his prey, which this is relaxation for Jerry. While that Colonel Tenderfoot was a rod away, Jerry turned his tail some sudden in his direction, and the next instant that helpless shorthorn stopped both of Jerry's rear heels somewhere about the second button of his shirt. Jerry's kick settled it. The Colonel was an invalid immediate. I surely had a time with him that night. The next day the Colonel couldn't walk and he couldn't ride in the wagon 'cause of the jolts. It all touched my heart, and at last I up and made a hammock out of a Navajo blanket, which is good and strong, and swung the Colonel to the reach of the trail wagon. It was mostly a good scheme. Where the ground was level, the Colonel came on all right. But now and then, when a wheel slumped into a rut, the Colonel couldn't help none but smite the ground where he was the lowest, and it all drew out groans and laments from him a heap. One time, when the Colonel's agony made him groan special strong, I saw Jerry bat his eyes like he enjoyed it, and then Jerry mentioned something to his mate over the chain. We were trotting along the trail at the time, and being he was the nigh-wheeler, which is the saddle mule of a team, I was riding Jerry's compadre, and when I noted how Jerry was that joyous about it, I reached across and belted him some abrupt between the ears with the butt of a shot-filled blacksnake. He'd rather let the way out of Jerry's glee, and he didn't get no more bliss from that tenderfoot's misfortunes as he was. It went along all right until I swung down to the crossing of the Canadian River. It was about fourth drink time in the afternoon, and I was allowing to ford the Canadian that evening and camp on the other side. The river was high and rapid from rain somewheres back on its headwaters, and it was wide and ugly. It wasn't more'n 4 foot deep, but the bottom was quicksand, and that false. If I let my wagon stop 10 seconds anywhere between bank and bank, I was gonna be shy wagons at the end. I'd be lucky if I won out the mules. It was sure a hard, swift crossing. I swings down, as I said, to the river's edge with my mind filled up about the rush I've got to make. It's either go through on the run or bog down. First, I settled in my saddle, gave the outfit the word, and then, pouring the whip into the 2-liter mules, I sent the whole 8-mule team into the water on the jump. The river was running like a scared wolf, and the little lead mules were hardly touching bottom. As the trail wagon took the water, and the 2-liter mules was plumb into the water up to their ears, a howl developed to the rear. It was my poor tenderfoot in his hammock under the trail wagon. He shrieked as the water got to him, and it all hit me like a bullet, for I plumb overlooked him, thinking of that quicksand crossing. It was sure too late now. I was in and I couldn't stop. To make things more complex, as the water cut off the tenderfoot's yell like puffing out a candle, a little old black mule, which is my off-pointer, lost his feet and went down. I poured the leather into the team the harder, and the others soared into their collars and drug my black pointer with them. Only he was under water. Of course, I thought at that time both the black pointer and the Colonel was surely due to drown a whole lot. We got across, the 7 other mules and me, and the second he skated out on the sand on his side, the drowned mule gets up and sang as triumphant as I ever heard. Swimming under the river didn't wear on him a bit. Then I went scouting for the Colonel, but he was vanished complete. Naturally, I took him for a dead-and-gone gent, and figured if some eddy or countercurrent didn't get him, or he didn't go aground on no sandbar, his fellow men would fish him out somewheres between me and New Orleans, and plant him and hold services over him. Being as I couldn't be of no use where it's a clean sweep play like this, I dismissed the Colonel from my mind. After hobbling and throwing loose my team, I lugged out the grub box all sorrowful and went to camp. After all that, I always played the Colonel for dead. However, years later, he one day came a-wandering into Wolfville. He wasn't tender this time. He was as hard as moss agates and as worthless. I renewed my acquaintance with him, and he tells how he got out of the Canadian River that day. But beyond that we consumed a drink or two together, I rather passed him up. There was a heap about him I didn't take to. The Colonel laid round Wolfville maybe for a week, peering and spying about. He said he was looking for an opening. And I reckon he was, for at the end of a week, he slapped up a joint out of tent cloth and fence boards and opened a dance hall square against Jim Hamilton's, which is already there. This here alone was likely to brood and hatch some trouble. But as if taking a straight header into Hamilton's game ain't enough, this colonel of mine didn't get no pianner, didn't round up no music of his own, but stood pat and pulled off reels and quadrilles and green corn dances to Hamilton's music going on next door. I had been through the Lincoln County War and had been romancing about the frontier for years, but I never tracked up on no such outrage in my life as this disgraceful colonel opening a hurdy-gurdy agin Hamilton's and mavericking his music that-a-way and dancing thereunto. It was the second night, and Hamilton concluded he'd see about it some. He came into the colonel's joint, calm and considerate, and gave it out that there's going to be trouble if the colonel don't close his game or play in his own fiddlers. "If y'all don't close your game or hunt out your own music," says Hamilton, "I'm mighty likely to get my six-shooter and close it for you." "See here," said my colonel, which he sure been learning since I parched with him on the Canadian. "The first hold-up who comes fooling round to break up a dance of mine, I'll surely make him hard to find. What business you got filling up my place with your melodies? You rolls your tunes in here like you own the ranch, and then you comes curving over and talk of gunplay, instead of me laying for you for disturbing my peace with them harmonies. I'm so good-natured that I yields the point and dances to 'em. Now y'all pull your freight," says the colonel, "or I'll fill you full of lead." This argument of the colonel's dazzled Hamilton to the degree that he don't know whether he's got the high hand or not. He thought for a minute, and then pointed over to the Red Light Saloon for Enright and Doc Peets. As he left the rival dance hall, the colonel, who was calling off his dances, turned to the quadrille, which was pausing pending the dispute, and shouted, "You bet I knows my business. Right hand to your partner, grand right and left." When Hamilton turned away, they was sure making things rock and tremble, and all to the strains of the Arkansas Traveler, which was being evolved next door at Hamilton's expense. "Something's gonna pop," said Hamilton, mighty ugly to Enright and the rest of us, as he poured a drink into his neck at the Red Light Saloon. "I allows in the interests of peace that I canters over and sees you all first. Now I ain't out to shake up Wolfville, nor give Red Dog a chance to criticize us none as a disorderly camp. But I ask you gents, as citizens and members of the Vigilance Committee, whether I'm to stand and let this here sharp round up my music to hold his revels by, and put it all over me nightly." "I don't see no difference," said Dan Boggs, "between this convict a stealing of Hamilton's music than if he goes and stands up old Monty in the stage." "The same being my idea exact," said Texas Thompson. "Here's Hamilton catering to this camp with a dance hall. It's a public good thing. If a gent's morose and his whiskey's slow placing itself, he goes over to Hamilton's hurdy-gurdy and finds relaxation and relief. Now here comes this stranger, and I makes it $50 even he's from Massachusetts, and what does he do? Never antes nor sticks in a white chip, but purloins Hamilton strains and pulls off his dances thereby. It's plumb wrong, and what this party needs is a hanging." "Oh, I don't know," said Cherokee Hall, who was in on the talk. Hamilton's all right, and a square man. All he wants is justice. Now, while I deems the conduct of this stranger low and ornery, still, coming down to the turn, he's on his trail all right. As this sharp says, who gives Hamilton any license to go filling his hurdy-gurdy full of dance music? Suppose this gent would come capering over and set in a stack against Hamilton for overloading his joint with a piano and fiddle noises without his consent, and putting it up he's out to drag the camp if Hamilton don't cease. The only way Hamilton gets round that kind of complaint is he don't own them waltzes and quadrilles after they fetches loose from his fiddle, that they ain't his quadrilles no more, and he's not responsible after they stampedes off into space. That's straight, says Dave Tutt. You alls can't run no brand on melodies. A gent can't own no music after he cuts it loose that-a-way. The minute it leaves the bosoms of his fiddles, that's where he lets go. After that, it belongs to any gent to dance by, cry by, set by, or fight by, as he deems meet and pleasant at the time. So what do you all say, says Hamilton to Enright and Doc Peets. Does this here piece of oppression on a leading citizen, perpetrated by a rank outsider, go? I sure waits for your reply with impatience, for I itches to go back and shoot up this new hurdy-gurdy from now till sunup. Enright took Doc Peets down by the end of the bar, and there was no doubt about it that Peets was the wisest longhorn west of the Missouri, and they had a deep consultation. We alls was waiting some interested to see what they says. It was sure a fine point this colonel was making to justify and back his game. Get a move on, Enright, at last said Dan Boggs, who was a hasty, eager man who liked action. Get a move on, you and Peets, and settle this. You're delaying the play. Well, gents, said Enright at last, coming back where we alls was by the door. Doc Peets and me sees no need deciding on them questions about who owns a tune after said tune has been played. But there is a subject, that-a-way, which requires consideration, and which most likely solves this dance-hall deadlock. In all trade matters in a growing camp like Wolfville, it's better to preserve an equilibrium. It's against public interest to have 2 or 3 dance halls, or 2 or 3 saloons, all in a bunch that-a-way. It's better they be spraddled about wide apart, which is more convenient. So Peets and me proposes as a rule for this here camp that 2 hurdy-gurdies be forbid to be carried on within 500 feet of each other. As it looks like nobody objects, we concludes it's adopted. Naturally, the last hurdy-gurdy up has to move, which disposes of this here trouble. Before I ends what I has to say, Enright continued, I wants to thank our townsman, Mr. Hamilton, for consulting of the stranglers prior to a killing. It shows he's a law-abiding gent and a credit to the camp, and mighty likely he prolongs his stay on earth. If he'd pranced in and scalped this marauding stranger, I don't reckon we could avoid swinging him at the end of a lariat without making a dangerous precedent. As it is, his rival will be routed, and his life made serene as heretofore. As to the execution of this new rule, Enright concluded, we leaves that to Jack Moore. He will wait on this party and explain the play. He must up stakes and move his camp, and if he calls on another shindig after he's warned, we alls take our ponies and our ropes and'll yank his outfit up by the roots. A gent of his enterprise, however, will come to a dead halt, and his persecutions of Hamilton will cease. "And y'all calls this here a free American outfit?" said my colonel, mighty scornful, when Jack Moore notified him. "If I don't line out for the other end of camp, y'all are gonna rope my joint and pull it down? Well, that lets me out. I quits you. I'd be surely degraded to put in my time with any such low-flung passel of sports. Y'all can go back and tell your folks that as you leave, you hear me give the call to my guests, all promenade to the bar, and the dancing is done. Tomorrow I'm going to depart for Red Dog to begin life anew. Wolfville is too slow a camp for any gent with any swiftness to 'em. Goodbye." And that concludes Alfred Henry Lewis's 1897 story called The Rival Dance Halls of Wolfville. As asked in the introduction, have you ever been picked on by a mule? Tell us about it in the comments section. This is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you like the music you heard in the introduction and throughout the story, stay tuned to hear more at the end of this video. You can find more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end screen icon. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the playlists icon. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.